Right, so vultures. I guess probably I should tell you how I first got into this particular conservation program. And actually it was quite weird. I had a phone call from David Houston, who is a scientist that I know well from Glasgow University, and he had been contacted by the Parsis. The Parsis are Zoroastrians who have their dead eaten by vultures. And the bulk of them live in Bombay, which is now Mumbai. And their problem was that they weren't having any vultures coming in to eat their dead. So I went over to Mumbai and had a look at the Towers of Silence there, which are quite amazing. It's 57 acres of land, right? It's slap bang in the middle of Bombay. It's like owning Hyde Park. It's that valuable a piece of land. And there were no vultures there. I then got taken around to various boneyards and slaughterhouses where normally you would expect to see lots of vultures, and again, no vultures, plenty of kites. Bombay has got the most amazing population of kites, at least I hope it has still got it. And so I put together a program for them because they just wanted to put a big net over the top of the biggest of what they call the dakmas, and just lob some vultures in there, which would not have worked because they would have died very quickly. And the other problem is, or was, which of course we didn't know till much later, is that I suspect the first vultures that died were probably those eating the Parsis, because I'm sure it's not news to any of you that eventually it was found out that it was diclofenac, a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory, which was killing them. And that was invented in the 1960s for humans. In fact, I've actually taken it as a drug for relief of pain. It's not very good for you. It's bad for your kidneys. Not as bad as it is for vultures though. And so as the Parsis would undoubtedly have been given diclofenac, then there's a very high chance that the first vultures that died were them, because it wasn't actually licensed as a veterinary drug until the late 80s. So it is very interesting. Then in 1999, there was a big meeting in Delhi, where the fact that there was a huge crash was really brought to everybody's attention. And it was an international meeting. And of course, at that time, nobody knew what the problem was. I started work then with the team from ZSL and the RSPB, and Andrew Cunningham was fairly convinced that it was a virus. We looked at lead poisoning, we looked at various other things, but nothing would have killed vultures quite like the numbers we were seeing. We felt, or they felt, but a virus could have done so, as we see now with COVID. So we looked at it. I designed a holding place, basically a rehabilitation place in Haryana state in Pinjore. And Dr. Prakash, who had actually highlighted the crash when he worked at Kaolido National Park, he then went to work there. And what we tried to do was get in vultures that were sick before they actually died, and then see if we could get them to recover. And actually, if they've only just had diclofenac, you can, by giving them lots of fluids and flushing it through. But of course, we were pretty much working in the dark. So this went on, and it is really interesting. I designed the aviary, or a couple of aviaries, and then I went over after it had been built to see it. And that was a bit of an eye-opener, because there was nothing like what I had designed, nothing. And there were big iron posts right in the middle, which of course would have been a nightmare if the vultures had been healthy and flying and hit them. So we had to, what you have to do in a conservation program like this, in what was then a developing country, is you have to be able to look around and see how you can solve a problem. So you've got to be able to solve them with ways that are not necessarily what you would do over here. So in the end, we put reed all around all these posts so that if the birds did hit them, they wouldn't hurt themselves. And we had another problem there with perching, because we were only allowed to use eucalyptus wood. Eucalyptus is horrible wood, absolutely vile. It's very slippery, and it should be in Australia anyway. That's where it belongs. And it was the only wood we were allowed to use. So we were starting to get foot problems. And so again, I had to say, okay, what can we do? Can't put AstroTurf on it because you can't get it over in India. Well, you can, but it would have been astronomically expensive. And we weren't going to put carpet down. So in the end, we put coconut rope round, and we wound coconut rope all the way around these perches, which works really well. They have no foot problems. The vultures have a great time ripping it all off again. So they're having fun, and somebody else has to put it all back on again. So everybody's happy. And then in 2004, there was a big conference in, where was it? Was it Budapest? Somewhere like that. And it was announced that it was diclofenac. It had been discovered by a chap called Lindsay Oakes, who was a scientist working for the Peregrine Fund. And what they'd done, they had tried to work in India, but India was at that time, and to a certain degree still is, quite difficult because you can't take samples out. They're very worried about losing their DNA of whatever it is. I think it's partly because some Americans went over and took bits of the neem tree, which is a very, very, very important tree to Indians, and then tried to patent it. Great. And, you know, my personal opinion is my DNA is mine, a neem tree's DNA is a neem tree's, a vulture's DNA is a vulture. It doesn't belong to anyone else and can't be patented, but apparently it can. So we couldn't get samples from the dead vultures out of India, and neither could the Peregrine Fund. And there weren't really any labs in India that could look for the things we needed to look for. So they moved to Pakistan, where they had hundreds of dead vultures, and sent samples off to America. And that's how come they found out that it was diclofenac. So there was then a big meeting in near Pinjore, again, another international meeting, or two, one in Nepal and one in India. And we put together a plan to see what we could do about solving the problem. I was involved in two things. One was to do a survey across the world to zoos and rehabilitation centers to see what NSAIDs could be used with vultures without killing them. And that's where we discovered that really the only one that appeared to be safe was meloxicam. And I was also involved in tasks with the program for conservation breeding. We felt, as vultures were still dying like flies, that we had to get some in captivity and have a safety net of vultures. So that's exactly what we did. So I designed the conservation breeding aviaries and the program. And this time I made sure it actually was built the way it should have been. And again, when you, it's very difficult to compare what you would do over here or in America or wherever you are, to what you can do in India. And for example, you don't want to use any wood in India because it'll get eaten by heaven knows what, small insects, termites and what have you, in about 2 minutes flat. And wood is also very expensive. So we use metal and brick, and concrete, which you wouldn't think would have been the cheapest way of doing it. When we first started a colony aviary, and the colony aviaries I designed are 100 feet long, 40 feet wide, 20 feet high. Should probably have made them a bit shorter in hindsight because it's an absolute bugger to try and catch them. And inside were trees, branches, perches, baths. We had sand on the floor so we could clean it properly. And the first few we built were the equivalent of £10,000 in this country, and now they're about £50,000 and probably more, looking at the price of steel now. So one of the things that I try and tell people all the way through is that a conservation breeding program should be one of your last resorts. It's incredibly expensive. It's incredibly using of manpower. You need stable electricity supplies. You need people to teach the people who are actually going to be doing the husbandry and the conservation breeding. It's if you can avoid it, and this coming from someone who does captive breeding, avoid it, because there are more important ways of doing it if you can. but like getting the habitat right. And that was a part of the brief. That was not my part, but that was all to do with other people in BNHS, which is the Bombay Natural History Society, the RSPB, and various Indian governments, was to try and get diclofenac banned as a veterinary drug. And I have to say, all power to India. They banned it in 2 years. It was banned as a veterinary drug by 2006, which, if you look at how long it took to ban DDT in this country, which was 20 years, that's actually pretty impressive. And once India banned it, then other countries followed suit. And that tends to be what happens over there. When India does something, if it's in terms of conservation, then other countries will go, okay, well, we'd better now. Although, to be fair, Bangladesh was the first one to ban ketoprophene, because we've now discovered that it's not just diclofenac. I digress. So we built the conservation breeding program, and we decided that to start with, we would try and make sure that we did natural breeding, i.e. no interference. We would just put the birds in there and we would leave the birds to it, which we did. And I was going to be really organized for this meeting and have the SAVE website up, because it actually does a really interesting timeline. And unfortunately, I have no idea how to get it up. Now I've got Zoom all over the shop. So if I get any dates wrong, tough, you'll never know anyway. Have a look on the website. You can then put me right afterwards. So we bred them first in captivity, I think, in 2007 or 2008. And that was huge to be able to say that we'd bred them. They have been bred before. There was a very small population in Europe in zoos. I think it was no more than 30 birds, and it might have been 15, I can't remember. And they were bred, but that population has pretty much faded away to nothing. And in fact, a chap called Manfred Horstman in this country had 4 in Wales, and he bred them as well. But again, they're now long gone. So there are 3 species that we're mainly interested in, which I probably should have said right at the start of this, which is the Oriental white rump vulture, also known as the Indian white-backed vulture, the long-bill vulture, which never had quite such a population crash. The Oriental white rump vulture had a 99.9% crash in a 20-year period, which is staggering. The long bills didn't do quite so badly. I have no idea why, and I don't think anybody else does either. And the slender bills, which were by far the rarest anyway, they are still very much something we worry about. At the same time, it looks like the Egyptian vulture in India, which is a different race from the European and North African one, is also declining. And what used to be known as the Pondicherry vulture, but is known in India as the king vulture or the red-headed vulture, they too are declining as well. For me, the interesting thing is what is happening with the Himalayan griffin, because the Himalayan griffins come down from where they breed, which is China, Kazakhstan, basically the Himalayas and on north. And they winter in places like Bangladesh and in India. So they have to have been picking up diclofenac, and they have to have been dying. They're amazing birds. I've got a photograph of Holly, who's my curator, holding one at the center, because we get injured ones brought in. And its head is about here and its tail is below her knees, but they're really nice. They're wonderful, quiet, much quieter than the others. So back to the breeding program. So we started breeding them in India, and we had a program also in Nepal, and the Hawk Conservancy had a program in Pakistan, although poor old Campbell hasn't been able to go over there for years because it's not the safest place to go and you can't get insurance. So none of us, I think, have been there for a while. And Nepal had the same design of aviaries. They used a bit more wood. They used teak. It's in the middle of Chitwan National Park. So you can bump into a rhino or an elephant. In fact, there's been a perishing elephant knocking down the building that the staff work in at least 3 times now. They did try putting up an elephant fence, but apparently elephants don't take a lot of notice of elephant fence. The ones we have 4 centers in India. The first one in Pinjore, just outside Pinjore. The second one is in Buxa, near a place called Raja Batkawa. And that is in the middle of lots of elephants. And every time I go, I've never seen an elephant there, but they always say they came the day before or the day after. But they're very clever at getting the fence sorted out. They'll either shove a young elephant against it and then it shorts out, or they'll drop a branch on it and the same thing happens. You have to hand it to them. They're quite clever. Not that I have any desire to play with one. So, breeding center in Nepal, we have bred there. They are nowhere near as successful. And I think that's partly because we couldn't do any real management there. We had to leave it just to the birds. And there was 1 year where we bred 9, but the breeding has declined since then. And I don't know why. And the only way to find out in Nepal would be to send someone out there for the whole of the breeding season and see what happens. But Nepal has been absolutely staggering on its getting the environment right. They have made vulture safe zones pretty much over the whole of the bottom half of Nepal, and the top half's all Himalayas anyway. So the whole of the lowlands there are pretty much now diclofenac free. And so the vulture population in Nepal is not only stable, but is now increasing. So again, we go back to that, what do you do with the conservation breeding program? And the answer is you stop it, because the justification isn't there in Nepal to keep doing it. India is a different case altogether. India is A, huge, B, they haven't been able to get vulture safe zones as well organized as Nepal did, partly because it's a tiny country, and partly because Nepal has huge support from its government. But bear in mind, it's one central government and they pretty much sort out everything, where in India, you've got central government and then you've got each state has its own state government, and trying to get that many people working together is flipping impossible, especially as a lot of people don't think that vultures are that important, where tiger conservation gets a huge amount of money, Sarah Christie. So India, we had then decided what we would do is we would go and start to do artificial incubation, because we were breeding them, but we wanted to breed more. We wanted to double clutch them. We wanted to see if we could double clutch them and see about the rearing. So what we did was we set up an incubation facility in Pinjore. It's at the moment the only one that is up and running. There is one built in Buxa in West Bengal, but unfortunately it keeps on getting struck by lightning. And so the power goes off, which makes life a bit tricky. And we haven't done one at all in either Bhopal, which is where we have another one, or in Assam, which is where we have the third one. So we started taking the eggs and incubating them. We ran 3 or 4 incubation courses. We've done 2 or 3 in India, and everybody from other countries is invited to that. And we've done at least 2 over here, which have had people from India and Nepal and Pakistan. And they have done amazingly well. We can breed them, we can double clutch them. The birds do lay a second egg. We are rearing the young, we rear them. We do what's called crush rearing, which is we rear them in groups. They learn to pick up food by the time they're only 6 or 7 days old. And so you don't have to have much man management. You can pop them into an aviary in groups, quietly put the food in, and by the time they're full grown, they're as wild as a wild vulture. And we have actually bred from crash reared non-parent reared birds. So I'm very happy that we have actually done the job and done what we were supposed to do. But what was happening was we weren't hatching the second egg. The second egg was left under the parents. Bearing in mind they only laid 1 egg. So the first egg came in, second egg was laid usually within about a month, and we left that to the parents, and it was singularly unsuccessful. So in the end, I said, okay, we need to try and find out what's going on here. We need to know if the eggs are fertile. We need to know if they're hatchable. We need to know if the chicks are healthy and if they're rearable. So I said, what we're going to do is we are going to take the second egg and we are going to put back the first chick. Well, you can imagine people were a little bit worried about that, and they thought it wouldn't work, that the adults would kill the chick, that they wouldn't look after it. But bear in mind, that's what an awful lot of what we do in our conservation breeding here is exactly that. If we want to increase the numbers, we double clutch, and where possible, we put chicks back for parents to rear, because you want parent rear birds. And also, if they keep laying eggs and they don't ever get anything to rear, after a while, your chances of breeding them become less. So I said, okay, well, I'll come over and I will do it with you, and we will put chicks back and it'll all be fine, said she, praying that it would be. Because it doesn't always work. I have a pair of black kites that would love to eat all their babies. So I went over, and it was in February. We had about 9 chicks of varying sizes, bearing in mind they're not like chickens and they don't all lay in one go, which is a bit of a drag, really. So I went into the aviary, climbed up a ladder that health and safety would have had a pink fit about, made of bamboo. Took a baby with me, took the egg away, put the chick back, came down the ladder, handed the egg to somebody to take it away. They went and took it straight into the incubation room very carefully. And we then came out of the aviary and we went quickly to look at the CCTV cameras. They have so much CCTV cameras. I'm really jealous. I'd love to have it here. And by the time we got into the room with the CCTV camera, the parents were feeding the bird. So it was a huge success. We put back all 9 chicks. All 9 were looked after really well. There was one parent bird that we didn't put anything back with because she wouldn't get off the nest. And there's only so hard you can push up a bamboo ladder with a bird that's that size that doesn't want to get off the nest. So that one kept its egg and I forget what happened. And so we brought the eggs in and they were fertile. We incubated them and they did hatch, and we reared them and they were reared fine. And the only thing I can think of that goes wrong in the aviary is that in that month between them laying the first egg and laying the second egg and then starting to incubate, the temperature goes up enormously in India. And although birds can keep eggs warm when it's cool, it's really hard to keep them cool if the temperature rockets. And I think, and I am extrapolating and it's pure guesswork here, but I think the reason the eggs failed under the birds in the second clutch was that the temperature was too high. So that's my theory and I'm sticking to it. So the breeding program in India is going okay. What we need to do desperately now is start to release birds. We have over 700 in captivity. And although we have built more aviaries, more colony aviaries, a lot of them now are overcrowded, which is a recipe for disaster if we had any sort of infection. We have put satellite tags on Himalayan griffins who have been released. There were 2 that had been in captivity for 10 years that were released. Those 2 didn't have a satellite tag, but they actually followed them on foot for 40 days and they actually survived that long. The ones in Nepal, the release has happened now. We have been releasing now for 3 years. And we have a fantastic release site. We have just altered the release aviary. We've made it larger so that the birds can fly around. And this is where a bit more, I mean, the release aviary wasn't small by any stretch of the imagination, but we've got it in a place, a good 2-hour drive away from the breeding center. And I am absolutely convinced that you should not have your release site next to your breeding center. I think, and in India we have, and I think it's wrong. And I've told them I think it's wrong for a number of reasons. To start with, at a release site, you need to encourage in wild vultures. If you encourage in wild vultures, then your biosecurity goes out the window. But, you know, once the birds are released, biosecurity is out of the window anyway. If you release your birds close to where they were bred, the chances of them leaving, and we see that in South Africa, are nil. They just hang around on the aviaries and wait for somebody to feed them, not surprisingly. So you need to do your release site well away from your breeding site. So in Nepal, as I say, it's about a 2-hour drive. We release them in groups of about 8 to 10. They stay in the release aviary probably too long at the moment. I'd like to see them in there just for about 2 to 3 months. At the moment, they're staying in there longer. And of course, COVID has completely screwed everything up. And they're all satellite tagged. They are also wing tagged. And I have to say, I have worries about wing tags. We have released 3 Oriental white rump vultures in India now, and they all had satellite tags and wing tags. And the wing tag was causing a problem with monkeys. Monkeys who are in the same tree as a vulture, they see this enormous colored thing on their wings, and they go and pull at it. And it's that attracts them. And then of course they muck about with the satellite telemetry as well. They wouldn't do it if the birds didn't have wing tags, because they wouldn't see the telemetry. It's fairly well hidden in the feathers, and it's not obvious like a wing tag. And I have huge problems with wing tags on actually most birds, because if you talk to a chap called Rory Wilson, who's fantastic and who is a professor at Swansea University, he will tell you anything you put on a bird, anything, a ring, a satellite tag, a wing tag will affect it. It affects the way it flies. They spent millions of years evolving to be their shape they are. And if you stick something on them, you do compromise them. So that has to be borne in mind. But they are all wing tagged. We've got satellite tags on some of the wild birds in Nepal as well. Our survival rate is not great. But one of the things I'm trying to tell everybody is that the birds that we are releasing, although they may be in adult plumage and they may be X number of years old, to all intents and purposes, these are very juvenile birds mentally. They have never been in the wild. They don't know how to survive. And so we should be judging the mortality rate of these birds, whatever age they are, against the mortality rate of juvenile vultures. And I'd almost go further and say, compare it to birds that have actually come in from the wild, juveniles that have come in from the wild, been injured and then rehabilitated. And most of us know that with birds that are rehabilitated, their survival rate ain't great. So we're trying to do different things to try and help with improving the survival rate of the birds, like increasing the size of the aviary. But then you come against things that you do think about, but you only think about it afterwards. And you go, oh, bugger, I shouldn't have done that. And what we did in America was, for birds being rehabilitated, we had a huge aviary, 100 feet long, not particularly wide, one perch one end, one perch the other end, and you gently persuade the birds to move up and down, because if you put a bird in an aviary, half the time it's not going to fly. You have to persuade it to. But the trouble is, if you persuade a vulture, it immediately vomits because it's not tame, and that is not a good thing. And the other problem you have is the temperature over there. So you can't push them because A, they throw up, and B, it's too hot, so they get stressed. So where we release them, my personal opinion is that fitness is actually not that crucial, because there is a stable, static population of wild vultures. They're actually breeding there, and there's food supplied. So the chances of being able to learn to be fit once they're released are actually very high. We've had 2 electrocuted. So what I hope we're going to do, we did think about putting up a pole with a minor electricity current going through it, so that if they sat on what looks like an electricity pole, it bites them and they say, oh dear, I'm coming off this. But I'm a little bit uncomfortable about doing that in the aviary, because you don't really want to make your birds frightened of a perch in the place they're living. So I've suggested that we do it outside of the aviary, make it look like a normal electricity pole, but have this little wire on the top that gives them a minor electric shock. And we'll not only be training them when they're released, but also teaching the wild birds as well. We have had 3, we think, eaten by predators. But when I say think, one of the biggest problems is that the postmortems aren't always as good as they might be, or you don't get a bird carcass in fresh. So there are all sorts of problems that you come across when you start to do the release that are very different from the breeding program, but it makes the whole thing pretty damn interesting. Yeah, you just send, if anyone has any questions, just send me an email. We're working on that, and we're also working on that highly politically sensitive program, the hen harrier brood management. So if people have got questions on that, I'm very happy to answer that as well.